We're back in session again. This time the questioning will be by the Board of Inquiry, and we'll lead off with John DeLisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to this panel. Mr. Hickerson, can I start with a question? Can you describe what a flight is for Hagelin? Is it one takeoff and one landing?
Hi, good afternoon. No, sir. Our flights are such that there's typically multiple stops. A very common practice amongst Alaska aviation is that these villages are clustered somewhat close to each other. So, in the sense of, we'll say Hooper Bay, Scammon Bay, and Chivak are all within about a 25 nautical mile radius of each other. They're about 130 miles from Bethel. So, our flight would be released with multiple destinations on that route back to Bethel, typically departing and arriving back to the same primary airport.
So I heard other words like route, segment, multi-leg segment. How does all of that terminology play together?
Yeah, when we look at a route, we're looking at the sequence that we are flying in between these destinations typically. Again, a flight departing from Bethel would be routed Bethel, Hooper Bay, Scammon Bay, Chivak, and then back to Bethel. The typical flight segment would be any individual segment flown between these two destinations. And again, for clarification, the route changes a lot of times in those villages. We don't know exactly what we're picking up, and that's why they would change. We may get a call from the village agent that says our competitor showed up a few minutes ahead of us and took all the passengers that we were planning on picking up, and so there's no reason to stop there anymore. That would be relayed back to the OCC, a conversation coordinated between the OCC and the aircraft, usually relayed, and then the route would be changed.
Interesting. So when we talk about the accident flight, I think we've spent a lot of time with the other panel talking about this Quinhagak to Togiak. Maybe we were calling that the flight, but can you better describe what the flight the accident airplane was on?
The flight was departed Bethel with the routing Bethel, Togiak, Quinhagak, Togiak, Quinhagak, Bethel.
How long would a flight like that take?
I would say that the approximation, if you will, would be approximately 30 minutes in between each destination. And again, I'm approximating. It's been a while since I've flown the line between Quinhagak and Togiak.
So perhaps from the time that airplane takes off from Bethel, makes all of those stops, completes its flight, gets back to Bethel, could be 3 or 4 hours later?
Yes, sir. That'd be correct.
So during the course of that 3 or 4 hours, in and out of Togiak, say, a few times, the weather's going to change a lot. You talked about in a rainstorm, the weather changing in 10 or 15 minutes. Wouldn't it be more advantageous to scope out the predicted weather at each one of those stops along the way, as opposed to just releasing the flight over the course of the next 3 or 4 hours and all of the weather changes that will occur?
Yeah, we did take that into consideration. We're looking at our operation as a whole over the entire state. A lot of our legs where we're operating multi-legs, 30 minutes may be one of the longest. We may operate a flight out of Bethel to 4 or 5 stops and be back in Bethel within 45 minutes. So that's not uncommon. Some of the destinations are literally across the river from Bethel, so a 3-minute leg. So to get a weather report on each side wouldn't necessarily be practical for our operation. We do have flights that are released again for longer flights, again out of let's say out of Palmer to Kotzebue, which is a 3-hour flight. It's a direct from here to Kotzebue. 3-hour flight, moving a caravan. Again, so the aircraft is still airborne for 3 hours, not required for any additional conversation or weather analysis.
Yes, in a flight that takes off from a departure point to a destination point, perhaps the weather forecasting ability, you know what the conditions are at the departure point, you have a prediction 3 hours later what it will be for your one landing. But when you're in and out of Togiak, Quinnipiac all day, isn't the weather going to be changing constantly during the 3 or 4 hours that the airplane may be in those airports?
Yeah, I would say that's a true statement that it could. Again, the forecast that we're going to get 30 minutes later is typically the same forecast we got prior to releasing the flight. So we're not opposed to any of these. We're just trying to see how they would fit the operation. Again, a lot of these locations we don't have any way to communicate. So if we designed a system that would require at each stop to make communication to the OCC for a new weather briefing, most of them don't have official weather, and then the communication piece has proven to be very challenging.
At our agency, we've dealt with a number of accidents involving helicopter air ambulance service, and we talk about the mission pressure that a pilot doing such a critical life-saving mission, state troopers flying rescue missions are under that same sort of pressure, and a key safety release in that is to take some of the decision making out of the cockpit, out of the person who's under that critical pressure, and give it to someone outside of the airplane who may be able to take a more clear-eyed view of the weather and the circumstances. That seems to be an important safety element in helicopter air ambulance service. I'm just thinking about having one conversation with OCC at the start of a 5 or 6 segment trip that may take place over the course of 3 or 4 hours and multiple weather changes. Doesn't that then just one time, once you get the okay from the OCA, but now it's all on the pilot who's in the airplane, in that weather, with those passengers, with that cargo? Wouldn't it be helpful to have checkpoints along the way that require that conversation to take place again and get updated?
Yeah, as I stated, we're open to all suggestions with that. But what we found is typically the weather that the pilot is seeing there out the windscreen is much more accurate given the inadequate weather reporting that the OCC is going to have available to them. So the most accurate report that we're going to have is from the pilot, and typically we may see that based on all available resources we have, that a flight looks like there's no reason it couldn't be completed, and the flight ends up turning around and coming back. The OCC manager does analyze each of those turnbacks to find out why, to see if we missed something from the operational control point. And typically what's found is that there's not data to support that weather reporting, and that the pilots are making good decisions turning around and coming back when they see, I don't want to call it unforecasted weather, but
Sure.
weather that we couldn't depict.
Thank you. I appreciate this conversation. And tying into panel 1, which talked all about CFIT, CFIT accidents take place in IMC conditions. And it would be great to have the infrastructure. We're going to do our part to help make that point. There's certainly a level of safety that's offered, but I'm a pilot. I'm not instrument rated. I only fly in VMC conditions, and that's a very safe way to operate. It's extremely safe to fly only in visual conditions. I don't fly when the weather isn't clear, but it seems like it's a combination of mission pressure and bad weather that become the recipe for CFIT accidents.
I would say historically that would be an accurate statement. What we've tried very, very hard to do with the removal of the business stress on the operational control function is to remove that from the station personnel altogether. There is not a flight that can be released unless the operational control center releases it. They don't have any idea how many passengers are in the lobby or how much mail is there, or any of those types of business functions. So we've removed that altogether. In addition to that, we've changed up our compensation, our pilot compensation package, to where there's absolutely no additional funding. The pilot doesn't get anything more for creating a flight. It would actually be much better for them. They could go home and still get paid the same that day regardless. So we have done everything we can, because I think you're spot on that historically that business pressure has driven risk to an unacceptable level. and I believe our model has been such that we've tried to address each of those.
Thanks. Mr. Gillespie, we heard earlier 600-foot ceilings, 2-mile visibility. Am I characterizing that as saying that's in the operational control spec for Hagelin?
Yes, sir, it is. Their minimums to obtain a special VFR clearance for departure and arrival is significantly higher than what regulatory standards are.
Is the FAA comfortable with the fact that that's in their operating specs, yet they're going to be relying on non-aviation sources to try to determine if the 600-foot ceilings and 2-mile visibility is available?
I don't understand. Can you restate that question?
Well, I think I heard earlier that you get information from unofficial sources, people in the local village, other resources on the ground. Those are not certified aviation weather forecasting reporting stations. Is the FAA comfortable with integrating non-official weather reports in order to determine if the company is operating within their specs?
Again, Mr. DeLisi, could it be improved? Yes, it could be improved, but that's what they have to work with. And the only time they need official weather is to operate IFR, which they are unable to do. So they can take the unofficial weather and conduct a VFR flight. That's why they're doing the flight VFR.
Very good. Thank you. No further questions.
Dr. Groff, you have questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel. Mr. Hickerson, just to put in context, we had a couple of indications of like the size of the operations of Hagelin. You mentioned, I think, 6,000 routes, one largest or the largest 135 operator. Can you put in context how many flights, either by week, month, year? I know that obviously changes probably seasonally, but can you give me some kind of a context of how many flights you operate?
Excuse me. Yes, we currently release approximately 55,000 flight releases, of which we typically have approximately 2.5 destinations, if that makes sense, per release. So we're looking at somewhere in the ballpark of 150,000 takeoffs and landings per year, excluding any training events.
Thank you. And as far as tracking the cancellations and turnbacks, it sounded like you've sort of ramped up the tracking and recording of that. So is it fair to say that we'll have to maybe check back with you in a year or two to know whether they're increasing or decreasing?
Yeah, I think as the technology advances and as the company makes technological advances for data tracking and data mining, we'll be able to provide a lot better information to you. Again, like I said, I know January and February was multiple thousands of flights canceled. I believe those numbers are probably the mirror what happened to last year, but we didn't track it the same. We see these big swings based on our flight time. You know, the 207 fleet is VFR only and flies about 50% the amount of flying in December that they do in months like July when the weather is much better. So it's an indicator of the weather patterns in Alaska and the night operations that were dealt with and those types of things that we end up just flying a lot less.
So to compare if it's increasing or decreasing, it's almost a year over year rather than I can't compare to last month. I can compare to maybe this month last year.
Yeah, we see very seasonal patterns, and what we're trying to do is take the tribal knowledge out of it, and that you know, I've been at the company now since 2003. I can tell you that the weather in Unalakleet in May has some morning fog that typically burns off by 3 o'clock, but we're trying to create a computer system that can track that to where it's not dependent on me being there, that we can forecast that much ahead of time in our proprietary software.
Understood. Thank you. And whether to either you or Mr. Tanner, I think you mentioned there's 6 OCAs. Is that right? So let's say on a given day, middle of the summer, when you would be presumably at a high level of activity, how many OCAs would you have working in the OCC, and how many flights or operations would they be monitoring at any given time? And
Certainly, there's a total of 6 OCAs, a supervisor. I'm sorry, there's 7 OCAs, a supervisor, myself, for 9 total. We generally, Monday through Friday, have 5 people. We work 6 a.m. till about 9 p.m. We'll have 3 people on at a given time at our busiest times, and then fewer at the slower times. And at the busiest times of the morning, we may have as many as 30, 35 airplanes airborne at the same time.
okay, and I think you mentioned this, but maybe just to clarify, what Hagelin is doing with the OCC is it's not a requirement; it's something that you've more or less created and developed.
Again, I think the 135 regulations allow the latitude to the carrier. Our operational control model was built and designed specifically for our operation. I don't believe that it may fit at much smaller operations, and obviously much larger operations would take much more. So we've to say that it's not required, it is required to have an operational control model, but it's specific to each individual operator to find what works for that operation, and I think that's what we've done here.
Okay, and how long has the current model been in place?
We opened in January or February of 2014.
February 2014. The risk assessment, the 4-point risk assessment, was that developed at the same time, or did that precede the development of the current OCC model?
Some elements of it preceded it. It's been, we're constantly evaluating that and modifying it. I think we're at revision 8 of it now. We had some version of that before, but when we ramped up the OCC, our current POI, Dan Larson, at the time, actually helped us build it and be in compliance with the 119 requirements for operational control.
And you anticipated a bit of my question there. I was just interested to hear a little bit about the development of the risk ratings, the elements. That is it a 1, is it a 2, and maybe how it was developed first, and then we can talk about how it's been modified.
And again, our former POI, Dan Larson, was a big part of that. One of the things that we identified from my prior 121 dispatch experience is we used to hand a pilot a dispatch release that had a risk number of 26 as an example, which really had no significant meaning to the pilot, what that number meant. So one of the things we wanted to do was develop something that was very meaningful to the pilot. They know what a number 1, number 2 is, and they also know what that letter associated with that risk is. And again, it's something that we've been working on and ever changing to better meet our needs.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Evans.
Again, we're pulling in information from a lot of different places that combine into this. When things happen at other carriers that maybe we didn't foresee, we may put that into our risk assessment. When we've gone to different conferences, there was a conference we went to a few years back in 2014 when this came out, and one of the presenters had made a statement that 35% of accidents under Part 135 happen on Part 91 legs. That's a statistic that was astounding to us, so we thought, that's something that needs to be put in the risk assessment. These are true statistics, so we're constantly evaluating the level of risk that different operations pose, and it's kind of a living document.
Thank you, and that's actually the remainder of my question then, because I was interested in how you monitor and how you've updated. You said it's on version 8, you said? Okay.
Yeah, it is on version 8, and again, when we first stood this up, there was a lot of pieces of the risk assessment that took 119 management approval. As you can imagine, at that time I was the chief pilot, but the DO and myself were getting a lot of phone calls. We've been able to modify that and look at really where the risk at our operation is and tailor it specific to the operations that we conduct.
And so, finally, just one more clarification. The PIC does this risk analysis, and then they communicate that to the OCA, and they compare notes. And if there's a difference in how those ratings fall, then perhaps they bring in management to have another point of view.
Correct, and it's important that we don't want a single point of failure. So when the pilot calls, we expect them to be prepared, to have gone over the weather and whatever sources they have available to them, and then the OCA is going to do that independently. So the two of them are both looking at the same thing, coming to an agreement, and they both have to be in agreement before there can be a release of the flight. And yes, if it's level 3 risk, then it's elevated to a third set of eyes, that being the designated manager.
And is the risk assessment process and the justification for any changes in that risk assessment process, is that part of recurrent training for all pilots?
Yeah, typically we take a lot of the input from the pilots themselves. One of the large changes that's been made recently, we made a change saying, you know, it used to be that day VFR was risk 1, and one of our pilots, very senior pilots, pointed out, you know, he thought that IFR should be risk 1 and that VFR should actually be risk 2, that it actually posed a greater risk. We were able to evaluate things like that. So we're taking information based off of the end user saying, where are you seeing the risk in our operation, and let's evaluate that. We try real hard not to dictate that from an office, and more get down on the ground with the people using the risk assessment to make sure that it's a valuable tool and not just something that we create to look good.
And finally, have you made any changes based on external input, either from FAA or Medallion Foundation audits?
Specific to the risk assessment?
To the risk assessment.
Well, I know that any time that we change the risk assessment, Charlie and myself are in constant contact. So Charlie has a wealth of knowledge and has a vast experience operating in Western Alaska. So there's typically not a whole lot that goes on at our operations as far as changes like that Mr. Gillespie wouldn't know about. As far as specific changes from Medallion, I don't recall any specific changes, but again, the input is always requested and valued. It's trying to capture what the industry best practices are and see how they apply to our operation, and that's something that Medallion brings to the table.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you, Dr. Groff. Understand that Hagelin no longer flies the Quinnipiac to Togiak route. Was that a business decision or a safety decision, or what kind of decision, if something else?
That is correct, that we're not offering scheduled service between Quinnipiac and Togiak, and it was a combination of those decisions. We did lack the aircraft after this accident to conduct those operations out of Bethel.
Another question for you, Mr. Hickerson. To clarify, the DCA is on the business side. Is that correct?
That's an accurate statement, yes.
But they're the ones who are calling the villages and the departure control agents for weather updates and other information which is really operational.
Yeah, a lot of times, and Gabe can correct me if I'm wrong here, a lot of times a lot of these villages don't call in by phone. It's actually by VHF radio. So they're actually radioing in what the weather is on the VHF radio, and that's very commonly used throughout Western Alaska, an actual VHF radio at each of these places. But this is all unofficial weather, trying to gather, again, just a perspective from the ground. What are you seeing? What does it look like? Because we don't have any other way to ascertain that information.
And Mr. Tanner, once a flight is released, and assume for a moment there's been an air turnback, what's the role of the OCC once that flight is released?
Regarding an air turnback?
For example, an air turnback.
Well, if there's an air turnback, either the departure control agent or the pilot themselves is going to report that to us after the fact. We're going to capture the data and analyze that to, again, what we're looking for is, did we make a good decision to release the flight? And, is this a case where the fog is coming off the coast and it wasn't something that we could have foreseen?
Along that same line, can you talk a little bit about flight following? And who's responsible for flight following? Who does it? What does it really consist of? How far does it go?
Certainly, we have proprietary software that incorporates all of our flight following tools into one screen so we can see our aircraft anywhere they are in the state. We've recently upgraded our 207 aircraft to have both spider tracks and ADS-B. Some prior to that, they only had ADS-B in the 207s, but now everything has all of our aircraft have both ADS-B and satellite-based tracking devices, and so we're able to monitor those aircraft anywhere that they are in the state.
And in the case of an air turn back, again, who makes the decision to do an air turn back?
That is with the pilot, and the only reason that they're going to do an air turn back is because they've encountered weather that won't allow them to continue. So either they're IFR and they don't have the minimums and they need to divert to an alternate, or they're VFR and they recognize IMC conditions ahead and they will either turn back or divert to an alternate.
So flight following is strictly advisory.
That's correct.
Okay. Does the tech panel have more questions?
Yes, sir, we do.
Proceed.
So, Mr. Tanner, just to start off, in a presentation earlier, or maybe it was that you said it, you said that 8 OCAs had completed dispatcher training. How many actually have their license?
We have 9 OCAs, and if I misspoke, 6 of the 9, and that includes myself, have either received 121 dispatch training or they hold a private pilot's license. Of the ones that have received 121 dispatcher training, all but one of those has actually received their certificate. One OCA successfully completed the training but has not yet obtained a certificate.
Okay, another question for you. Mr. Hickerson had talked about the importance of PIREPs out there for the operations. When these PIREPs get received by the OCA, do they go into the national system?
The PIREPs that go into the national system are submitted by the pilots themselves.
Okay, so if they just call one into the OCA, that doesn't get into the national system then?
That's correct.
Okay. We've heard a lot today about the infrastructure that's out there and how if the infrastructure existed, there would be more flights operating IFR. Mr. Hickerson, when Mr. France was out in Bethel and did a ride-along flight, the infrastructure existed, the aircraft was capable, and the pilot was capable. Pilot elected to go VFR anyway. Is this something that would concern you, or could there be other factors that play into the decision?
I need more information. I think again, as the chief pilot, Mrs. Witt, had stated that on paper a lot of these routes appear to be IFR capable routes. Through our route study, we've determined that 2/3 of the destinations we serve are not actual IFR capable routes. So again, I would need to know the specific location, weather and such. And again, as we stated, you will go IFR unless you can meet the night VFR minimums. And so again, some more specifics, I could probably speak to that, but.
Okay, and I think Mr. France can probably speak a little bit better to it. And one last question for you, kind of along the same line of thinking. When Ms. Burdick was up and she said, sometimes it's the time it would take to get the clearance to go IFR, say from Quinnahock down to Togiak, when the infrastructure exists, the pilot, and the airplane. So at what point does the timing for taking an extra 5 or 10 minutes to get the clearance outweigh the safety concerns for being able to go higher?
I think it's an assumption to make that it would be 5 to 10 minutes. It could be substantially longer. What we found during this IFR study, because we did, as you know, when we had our conversations, I believe it was in December, we put out a fairly hasty policy that all flights that could go IFR to what appeared on paper would be conducted IFR, and it was an utter disaster. It did not work. We had aircraft flying around, lost comms. It became quite apparent to us that lost comm procedures, if you were going to operate IFR to all of these airports, lost comm procedures would be a normal procedure, and that's not what it was intended to be. It put our crews and our aircraft at a higher risk to demand IFR flight in this state because it lacks the infrastructure to conduct those operations.
Okay, thank you. You fly out there more than I do, and that's why I wanted to find out as far as, you know, how long it actually takes and to kind of help us understand that. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Wilson?
Thank you. Mr. Tanner, you said that once a flight departs the base, that the OCAs will monitor those flights. What is the purpose of monitoring the flights?
The purpose of the OCA monitoring the flights is just to is for safety, to ensure that the flights get to their destination safely and return to base safely.
Okay.
There are other people in the company that monitor the flight for business interests, but not the OCC.
So in terms of monitoring the flights to ensure that they reach their destination, when would the OCA take action regarding a flight? What information are they looking for in the software to let them know that a flight has not arrived?
We have a number of things that we're looking for. Our tracking systems have airplanes that are yellow while they're actively reporting destinations and information, flight information. If the plane has not reported or pinged with its tracking device for 20 minutes, it's going to turn blue. That would be one indicator. When an OCA sees a blue airplane on the map, they know that they need to find out what's going on, and that happens from time to time, especially with ADSB coverage, not for the entire state. So then they will immediately start to research where that airplane is, contact the base and other sources to find out where the airplane is. We also have our progress bar in our software system. If the aircraft has not been moved along on its village routing for 30 minutes, then they get a flag that appears on the screen that tells them the airplane has not been moved for 30 minutes, and then they were going to initiate steps to locate that and verify where it is.
The SpiderTrax data that we received for the accident flight, the data points came at 6-minute intervals. How is it determined that Hagelin will use 6-minute intervals versus a shorter or a longer interval?
The options through SpiderTrax, my understanding is it's 6 minutes and 2 minutes.
And why did Hagelin choose to go with 6 minutes versus 2 minutes?
I'm not aware of the answer to that at this point. We do have ADSB coverage that covers most of the state, and so this is again supplemental to where that coverage is not. The state is fairly well covered, but there's a handful of places that still lack sufficient coverage, ADSB coverage.
So are all aircraft equipped with ADSB?
Yes, as well as SpiderTrax.
The village agents, who are they employed by?
They're employed by the company.
So they're employed by Hagelin?
Yes.
What is the reason for not giving them some sort of weather training if they're going to be reporting on weather at these villages?
Again, the role of the village agent is to move the mail or freight from the airport down to the local village, to the stores. The operation's not dependent on whether the village agent's there or not. Again, we may have different people fill in, trying to find a a workforce that's there 7 days a week can be a challenge from time to time. And so again, even if it's not the village agent that we're calling for weather, if we're doing charters for, let's say, the school, we may call the principal and say, hey, what does it look like? We know that there was fog there this morning. Does it look like there's still fog? I mean, we're trying to utilize all available resources where there is absolutely zero resources. So our options are none or something.
Mr. Tanner, what benefits would there be to requiring licensed dispatchers?
Well, there's always a benefit to greater enhanced training. Yeah, there would always be a benefit to that. I think it could make it a little more difficult to find people. I don't know if we have an abundance of licensed dispatchers in the state. I think that when I got my 121 dispatch license and certificate, the examiner told me that I'd now earned a license to learn. And I find that to be true. I think that the most of the learning happens during OJT. And if I hire intelligent, reliable people, we can use the training available to us to get them well prepared.
Chairman Wehner, we've extended the time, or we have exhausted the time that was left over from the Board of Inquiry. We are ahead of schedule. Would it be okay to go for another 5 minutes on the timer?
That would be fine.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Gillespie, what changes have you suggested to Hagelin regarding operational control since the accident?
Somebody coughed right when you were in the middle of that. Could you repeat that?
I was asking, what changes have you suggested to Hagelin regarding operational control since the accident?
Well, the changes that are in that letter are, and what we've been working on is the changes that we were recommended to him.
So there's been nothing additional from that letter?
No, ma'am.
Mr. Hickerson, has Hagelin shared any information with the OCC or OCAs and DCAs in terms of reinforcing policies since this accident to try to prevent something like this from happening again?
Yes, ma'am. I think Mrs. Witt hit on that this morning, that we've brought in multiple agencies, and I think the Director of Safety in the next panel will discuss that, bringing in a company like GHS and having George Snyder's expertise, bringing in company best practices. Also, Mr. Green will enlighten you on the voluntary SMS program that Hagelin has decided to be part of. That's going to be a company-wide. So we're trying to improve all aspects of the company, not just one particular. I think this, as was stated earlier, is we're up against a large cultural issue. We're taking it head on, and there's not one small fix for this.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Gazzetti, we're not done yet, please. If you could please wait until the end. Thank you. Mr. France?
Yes, thanks. So, Mr. Hickerson, I'm going to give you the quick sketch of the flight that Mr. Williams was referring to, and then I'll let him re-ask his question. I was observing on a flight from Bethel to Russian Mission. It was flown VFR, and we were flying roughly 1,000 feet AGL. As we approached Russian Mission, the visibility appeared to be still within what the requirement was. The ceiling was indefinite, but it was near 1,000, perhaps a little higher. As we approached Russian Mission, we got a TAWS warning, a caution warning. And I looked at the display and I recognized, I saw the terrain ahead, so did the pilot. He did exactly what he should have done. He decided, you know, I can't climb higher because of this weather. I'm VFR, I'm going to turn around. He executed a 180 and we returned to Bethel. And on the way back, I had the discussion with him, you know, well, what about going IFR? Couldn't you have gone IFR to this airport? Was this, did you have what you needed? He said, yeah, we could have done IFR, but as is the case with a lot of destinations, we are concerned with once we're IFR in clouds accumulating ice. And many of these stations did not have de-icing capabilities, so the airplane may end up landing at one of these villages with ice on the airplane and then by regulation not able to depart because there was no way to de-ice it. So that was the way it was explained to me, and that was the nature of the flight. We returned VFR to Bethel, and that was the conclusion. So now I'll let Mr. Williams re-ask his question.
So, Mr. Hickerson, in this situation, it almost appears that it's not the infrastructure that was lacking. It was at the station being able to remove the ice. And that may not have been something that had been encountered before. Is that something since then that has been taken into account by Hagelin, and this equipment's been distributed out there?
Yeah, thank you. This is a problem that faces Alaska Aviation at every single village. These aren't stations. We're talking about dirt strips, typically not supported by anything there, so there's not a place to have de-icing capabilities. There's not power at the airports in a lot of cases. What Hagelin has done, and we have had in place for a number of years now, we created our own de-ice sprayer that can be carried in the aircraft. It's a very, very limited quality, or excuse me, very limited quantity of de-ice fluid, approximately 5 gallons. So getting some fairly small amounts of ice off of the airplane would be capable. But no, there is not a good answer for the removal of ice, and it's something when we talk about the risk to our operation and managing the risk at our operation, de-icing is one of the things that we have to deal with that I don't think other folks maybe in the continental United States deal with in the same facet.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, that concludes the technical panel questions for panel 2.
All right, very good. Now,
Mr. Chairman, may I ask just one quick follow-up question?
If it's a follow-up or clarification, yes, go ahead.
It's a clarification. For Mr. Gillespie, in the discussion about the VFR, for commercial VFR operations, can the pilot make their own observations of the weather?
Under 135, they can. Yes, sir.
And can the weather observation provided by a village agent or someone on the ground supplement the pilot's assessment of that weather?
Yes, it can.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have.
All right, thank you. This concludes the questions for panel 2. Mr. Williams, do we have any action items from this session?
Yes, sir. We have one we would like for Hagelin to provide the reasoning behind the 2-minute interval versus the 6-minute interval for the spider tracking.
That concludes panel 2. We will now take a 10-minute break, returning at 2:20.